All right, everybody, welcome back to part number 2 of the Chuck Morgan case, the mysterious death and disappearance, right? In part 1, we went over some fascinating aspects of this case. You have to listen to it first.
Yes. Wild.
Now you'll be able to see why we deep dived to this and why it was so much fun to talk about. So in part 2, we're going to talk a little bit more about escrow crimes.
Yeah.
What Chuck had gotten himself into a little bit. And we're going to talk really briefly about the mob, the CIA, and Amy, we have a few ideas of our own.
Yeah, and the Treasury. Also, just a note to our audience, Justin had to leave. He had to get back to doing transactions. So
that's right. Justin Stratton, who was our guest star in part number 1 of our series, was here to give us a lot of background on escrow and what a title officer is. And he himself works the business every single day. So he had to jet back to his office and get a deed recorded by 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
But he was just as blown away as you were. So it was so much fun to tell the story with him here.
If our audience could have seen his face.
So we left you guys hanging at the end of part 1 with a little bit of breadcrumbs about the theories surrounding Chuck's death and disappearance. So we're going to take it from here. Amy, grab your shovel again. You're off break. Okay.
I love it.
We need to get digging again. So a few days after Chuck's death. So this is in the summer of 1977.
Okay.
Chuck has been discovered dead. And just so everybody knows here, it doesn't end with just his death, right? This keeps going. And like I said, a few days after he's been discovered, his impounded car, a Mercury Cougar, was ransacked, as well as his office, where he was the president of an escrow company, right? How would one get into an impounded car to ransack it?
Well, and the fact that it was on police property.
That's what I'm saying.
It had to be an inside job.
Had to be, or at least someone dropped the keys somewhere, right?
Yeah, accidentally left them behind the gate underneath the rock.
Yeah, so Chuck has been murdered and somebody obviously is still looking for something. So, Amy, do you want to tell us what happens next at Ruth's house?
Oh,
Ruth is at home, right?
So
Ruth, Chuck's wife.
Yeah, 3 weeks after Chuck's death, 2 men claiming to be FBI agents arrived at the Morgan home. They told Ruth that they had to look through the house, and she describes it as they hurried up and opened up their badges really quick to show them their identification and then shut it really quickly. Now, she's still grieving the loss of her husband. It's 3 weeks. There's a lot going on. She has 4 kids, and she invites them in, not thinking later like she should have asked if they had a search warrant, anything like that. So they come in and they tore the house apart.
Oh my goodness.
So, and they searched for quite a while. It is unknown if they ever found anything that they were looking for.
Well, they left with nothing, right?
Well, that she thought.
Oh,
but,
that's a good point.
You know, she doesn't even know if they're real FBI agents now. And when Don Devereaux, who is the journalist that we'll talk about more in depth on part 3.
Yep.
But when he contacted the FBI and requested records through the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI claimed that they had never heard of Chuck Morgan. Now, I found and sent to Sarah, there's a vault that is available online with the FBI, and you can look at everybody as long as they haven't sent records to somewhere. But if they're still in possession of some records, you can click on anybody's name or search, and you can just see all sorts of stuff that they have on them.
So it's like a compiled list of all of the FBI files that have been requested previously by the Freedom of Information Act.
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming.
So now they're public.
Yeah, I'm assuming that they're no longer classified or, time experience, whatever. And they haven't given them to another department. Now, the FBI's website is very clear on they don't hold records that they've given away because they feel like if it's in another department's hands that they can't attest to the credibility of the record or whatever. I don't know. It might be a way of them just saying like, oh,
we don't know.
Yeah.
I spent like a good hour scrolling through that list, just like taking note of the files I wanted to read.
And I was like, this will be a rabbit hole for a different day.
This is over. So we do know that the FBI says we have no idea who you're talking about.
Yeah. And there are several rumors surrounding this case that Chuck was killed because he was involved with illegal activity that we'll go through and doing secret work for the government.
Or And we do actually know
Yeah.
there is some very clear evidence that Chuck was working inside of transactions for the mob.
Yeah, I mean, it is found later. So in May of 1977, so roughly a month before Chuck is killed, he is asked to testify as a secret state investigation on illegal activity on both sides of the Arizona-Mexico border and told people he was working undercover with the Treasury Department.
So he's going to testify.
He already did. Like, his deposition was recorded a month before his death.
I mean, so it seems like we can just end the case right there, right? Like, of course.
But
of course that's
like,
why.
Nobody's now saying that he is a secret state investigator, though. Like,
Sure, no one will claim him as their informant.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I've got a question for you then.
Sure.
If we've got a second. So these FBI agents, quote unquote, like they introduce themselves as such, ransacked the house looking for something.
Ransacked it.
To Ruth's knowledge, they didn't leave with anything. Although if they were looking for papers or something, they could have maybe
that
stuffed them
letter
in their
that
suits.
he told his parents he had.
I think so. We know from part one, you mentioned that from our case in part one,
Yeah.
Chuck was known to have kept a duplicate of
Yes.
every transaction he did that is now considered criminal. So
Yeah.
he had a duplicate, he had a copy.
But you had mentioned that his offices were broken into, so they would have already had his copy.
Unless he didn't keep them at his office. If you're running shady transactions and you know it and you're keeping duplicates for a reason, I don't think you would keep them in your office where they could be easily discovered by, maybe the maid or janitor that comes through at the end of the night or your assistant.
Often hear of like suspicious fires, but,
True.
breaking out. But
that's one thing this case doesn't have.
No, it doesn't.
It's the only thing this case doesn't have. But if that's true, and we also know that the $2 bill that was found clipped inside Chuck's underwear had what we assume to be a map, right? I think, in my unsolicited opinion of this case,
let's hear it. I love it.
that these FBI agents, quote unquote, were looking for a ledger.
Oh.
So, and we're assuming these weren't actual FBI agents. So now we're going to kind of shift over to the mob theory.
Yeah. Okay.
So it is known that Chuck was helping the mob do transactions with land purchases. And we'll explain that.
Now, this wasn't known up until like after his death.
Right.
So,
yes. He wasn't out like telling everyone that this is what he was doing.
Yeah.
It's been discovered now. But I mean, I feel like it's a pretty reasonable statement to say that organizations, whatever they are, that are doing illicit activity or keeping track of money, transactions going in and out, keep a ledger.
Yeah, I mean...
And it's always handwritten because we're not going to document this in the cloud, right?
Yeah.
Which didn't exist back then. But
I mean, if you're a fan of the mob stories, there's always a ledger that some mob family's trying to steal to kind of,
exactly my point.
Yeah.
Or bookies with gambling. There's always a handwritten ledger. I think that's what they were looking for. Or, I should say, or that perhaps this map that was clipped inside Chuck's underwear led to the destination of the duplicate files, or maybe more duplicate files.
Interesting.
Or third theory, and then I'm done, stacks and stacks of cash.
Well, I mean, like Justin said in like our first episode, why wouldn't he just write it out? I mean, nobody found the clipped $2 bill in his underwear anyway. Like, why didn't he just say like, hey, honey?
He wrote a code that he could understand.
Yeah.
And there's possibly a key out there somewhere. We don't know what it was. It was never discovered. But if in fact, and he was, so I'll just say it like he was, all right? He was working with the mob on these transactions, right? The mob was laundering money by buying land. Chuck is the escrow officer, so he's facilitating these transactions. And undoubtedly, he's getting paid on the side. And how do you pay someone on the side for side work, Amy?
Yeah, cash.
With cash.
Cash is kind of untraceable.
And if you have hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash, which we know he had at least a chunk of.
Yeah, 60,000.
You're probably not going to keep it at home. My bet would be, if I had to put money on it in a ledger somewhere, that the destination in this map or in this code was either where his money was buried or hidden, or where the ledger and or files were.
Interesting.
So, but and what would, let me just pitch this question really quick. If somebody's saving duplicate transactions, proof of what they've done, but they're hiding them, right? Was Chuck keeping duplicates to have on hand just in case he needed to bargain his way out of something? or to bribe somebody?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the journalist Don Devereaux that investigated kind of Chuck's death after, and like we said, we'll dive really deep into Don in episode 3 of this.
Because he comes way later in the story.
He does. Yeah, it's kind of after. I mean, he did find kind of this trail that went on, and he did find, that Chuck thought that having duplicates was kind of going to be his like life insurance policy.
Yeah, his get out of jail card.
Yeah, but it
didn't work. Neither did his bulletproof vest, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So let's just talk a little bit more about the ties to the mob. Do you want to do that for a second?
For sure. Okay. Let's do it.
So it is known that Chuck's involvement or ties with the mob is connected to the Bonanno family. Now, I'm retelling a story, so Bonannos, don't come for me.
Well, I mean, we should probably start before the
Bonanno. Okay. He was actually Joseph Bonanno, the crime boss, was known as Johnny Bananas. So you can call Bananas if you want.
Perfect. No, yeah. Let's just set up for our audience, though, the culture that was going on in Arizona and Tucson at the time before you go into Bonanno.
I've got all that right here. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the lead up. How's that?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. So we know that there's all of a sudden in the late 60s and 70s an influx of well-known crime syndicates and what is referenced in my notes as racketeers that are coming into Arizona all of a sudden, right?
Yeah.
They're relocating. They're on the run. We don't know for sure, but all of a sudden there's a big influx. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of background. I am going to reference the Bonanno family because there were direct ties to him. However, again, we're retelling a story.
Yeah.
Joseph Bonanno was the crime boss or the head of the family. And back where they were back east, so not in Arizona yet, a mob war had erupted. It's actually dubbed the Banana War. Right?
Oh, interesting.
And this was taking place in part because Joseph Bonanno had arrived from Sicily. So now he's in the United States. Okay? And he had taken the opportunity to make himself the boss or the head of the family after the death of Salvatore Manazzano, who was killed.
Yeah. And for our audience, just to kind of break it down, the Bonanno family is one of the 5 big crime families in New York at the time. So just like if you understand any of the mob history, like that's where this is going.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of ties within those crime families to Sicily, right?
Sure.
So at this time, again, Joseph Bonanno takes it upon himself. He's going to make himself the head of the family. And he is 26 years old.
Yeah, he was young.
So he now becomes the youngest crime boss known at that time, at least, to the families. Okay. So this mob war is going on. It's very, very stressful. And in 1968, Joseph Bonanno actually has a heart attack. And there's all this stress and there's all this risk and there's people dying in this war, right? So he agrees to actually retire and he's going to go to Arizona. Now, when it says he agrees to retire, I'm not sure who that agreement was with, but it is alluded to that agreement was made with kind of the coalition of the mob families.
Well, and when they say retire, it kind of almost means like we'll relocate.
It is. Absolutely.
Like he's not going to be like crime free.
No, he's not because he gets to Arizona and there's a lot of opportunity here.
I will say in newspaper clippings, Tucson is known and referred to as the smuggling capital.
Right. It's a thoroughway kind of between Mexico and the Western United States. And so there is actually some suspicion that Joe Bonanno now is kind of running the west side of the United States crime syndicate.
Yeah.
Okay? So he's in Arizona. Quick note, during 1978 to 1981, the Bonanno family was infiltrated by an undercover agent who referred to himself as Johnny Brasco.
Oh my goodness.
I know. So we actually do have some factual information from this time period and from what was going on because there was an informant.
Yeah.
Or an undercover agent. Not informant. So here we are in Arizona. There's a lot of opportunity for new development of a crime family reestablishing here, right?
Well, and I'll say Arizona now has the same problem that New York is having. There's a lot of public servants, DAs, policemen that end up being kind of corrupted by this mob money that's coming in.
I know nothing about that.
Oh, really?
Even if I did, I wouldn't say yes. We're in Utah. We're far away from Arizona.
Yeah.
We're not even close, so don't come visit. But what happens is now this family and these racketeers are kind of collecting here, and they're getting the words out that there's business opportunity here. So they actually start buying up properties, businesses, and they discover they can actually buy land. So there is a loophole that's discovered in Arizona law that you can buy land under a blind trust. Now, in part 1, where Justin explained a lot about the escrow industry and how it works, we did ask him what a blind trust is. And he made a very interesting note that they're not inherently bad. So the story is calling it a loophole, but in all reality,
we still have them in our day.
We
right
do.
now.
And it's less of a loophole and more just there was an obvious opportunity to take advantage of this system.
Well, I think the opportunity is because you can remain anonymous, which you can't nowadays. There has to be a record. And Justin talked about how every state keeps those records.
Now, and we're talking in the 70s, right? Where a lot of these systems weren't developed. So the purpose of a blind trust is, yes, like you can't trace back who is the owner of the trust, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Or who's behind it. So what's happening is this money is being funneled through, land is being sold, and the mob, according to the retelling of the story, right, is now laundering their money. Which mob money has to be laundered. It has to
be cleaned somehow.
It has to be, because if they're just sitting there on stacks and stacks of cash, it's obvious something's going on. So they actually launder money through legitimate businesses, right? And this was a perfect opportunity because Arizona is a desert. It's large. There's a lot of land that nobody's ever checking up on and looking at. And so Chuck becomes sort of the facilitator of these transactions.
Yes.
Right?
He became, and it is known that he at least dealt with one member of the mob. And it's suspected multiple, but he's
tied in.
Yeah, he did a deal and then kept doing them.
Right. And I had an interesting thought that, Chuck, who's been in Arizona for a long time, right? He's not the only escrow officer in Tucson, I'm sure. He can't be. So it feels almost like he was just a coincidental pawn, right? Like the mob moves there and they're going to start running these transactions, these blind trusts, and they need an escrow agent, but they could have picked anyone. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
I mean, not anyone, but you see what I'm saying?
Chuck was described as being naive, and so maybe they took advantage of that naivety.
And he was also the president of his own company, so there's probably some, capabilities.
Less questions are being asked.
Sure.
If you're going to the top.
Sure. But you can definitely assume that he was kind of an unassuming, like,
I don't know. Did he know though?
Pawn.
I mean,
well, I just mean like he fell into it.
Yeah.
He didn't spend his life like prepping and stretching out to join the mob when they showed up.
I guess there's nothing in Chuck's background that, at 26, he wasn't becoming a crime boss.
An assistant to a crime boss. Yeah, exactly my point.
Yeah.
So, Amy, tell us a little bit about the transactions that were happening. Can you tell us a little bit about the gold?
Yeah.
Where it went?
Sure. So, and we'll also reference this again, just because there's just so much information. So if you don't get it the first time, that's totally fine.
So, Amy, do you want me to share a little bit about what the assumed process for laundering this money is? And then you can explain a little bit more. You know a little bit more about this than I do, but it's been discovered, it's been traced back that what was happening, most likely was happening, that these transactions were being created. So these files were being created by the escrow officer, right? We're going to open a transaction and transact the buy and sale of the land. And he was recording these transactions as though they were being paid for or being completed in gold, right?
Yeah, gold and platinum.
So, but this gold and platinum doesn't actually exist.
No.
So you're recording the document as being paid for in gold or platinum, okay? And then from there, you got to wash the money. So you pass the transaction data from bank to bank to bank, wherever it goes.
Different states. Like I know sometimes it went to LA and sometimes it went, there was like multiple.
Right, where their other ties were maybe. And then eventually the paper trail or gold trail, if you will, just goes cold, right?
Yeah.
It gets washed away into the system.
It legitimizes because it's come from so many institutions.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, tell me a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, he was doing large transactions And they
Billions
were
of dollars.
Yeah, they
right?
were occurring weekly and monthly between 1973 and 1977. And it ended up being in excess of $1 billion that he was kind of funneling for them,
That's incredible.
which is $8 billion in our money now. So, I mean, that's just crazy. And we'll deep dive into this more on the next part 3.
Yeah,
I don't
sure.
want to give way too much because it wasn't until a journalist kind of uncovered where this was, because
Right.
at this time, they didn't know where this was happening when Chuck was killed.
They don't.
The police, yeah.
Only someone knows, but it was someone on the inside.
And, I will say that there's still narcotics and things like that are going through this area. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that was happening. It was a pipeline and a haven for these monsters to come through.
Wow.
And it was easy because all of these members of the mafia, it wasn't just one member. They can remain anonymous. So
Sure.
it was just crazy.
Billions of dollars and
$1 billion.
transactions.
Now, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Worth billions now. These transactions are just racking up, stacks on stacks. They're getting faster and more frequent, which oftentimes
weekly. If you're recording,
that's frequent.
As an escrow officer, if you're recording land deals weekly, Justin's not here for this part, but
it's a lot.
I wonder how many red flags that would go up now. You know what I'm saying?
And they didn't have the technology back then to do a lot of things we do now, of course.
Yeah, with the same people.
Right. But the transaction speed and quantity are really picking up here, which, I think it's well known that the more and more, I'll use the word greed, but I'm not accusing any one person of it. There's multiple players here. The more and more that builds up, the bigger chance it has of bursting.
Yeah. You're going to be found out.
Yeah. And unfortunately, Chuck lost his life. And
yeah,
we can't tie it back to one person or one weapon or, one exact answer. But there's a lot of evidence here to support that these ties, and no matter what, truthfully, however you step back and look at the whole case, the reality is he was involved in some shady stuff.
Yeah.
And no matter what the reality of the resolution was, which we don't know, all of those kind of fit in and make sense. It could have been.
He was squeaky clean as
he appeared to be.
Yeah.
Right. So I do just want to know, back in part 1, we talk about this a little bit, but after Chuck's first kidnapping, when he returns home, he does tell his wife, Ruth, that he was a secret agent or an agent for the Treasury and that his captors took his Treasury ID. We don't know much more about this.
Do we have secret Treasury agents? I have never heard of a secret Treasury agent.
Of course you haven't. They're secret. So on July 5th, 1965, the U.S. Secret Service was formed to catch counterfeiters. In 1867, that can't be right. Oh, I'm sorry. On July 5th, 1865, not 1965. 1865, the U.S. Secret Service was formed to catch counterfeiters. In 1867, the mission of the Secret Service broadened to detecting persons perpetrating frauds against the government. Now, that was all a part of the Department of Treasury until 2003, and that has now been shifted and is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. Yes. So there was an organization that was secretive, that was in existence to catch counterfeiters.
Well, I will say, if he's part of this and he's doing these and keeping ledgers and whatever and sending information back through what would have had to been mail or phone calls or whatever,
right?
This would have been the perfect cover, I guess, for him to be well, actually, I'm a secret agent.
Absolutely. He was an excellent fit for what this role hypothetically was.
No wonder he was having yearly panic attacks.
Absolutely. Which you bring up. So I'll just lace this in right now. We reference in part 1 that Chuck was known to overwork himself to the point where he was so stressed he had a mental breakdown about once a year. Now that's been said by coworkers. So we're assuming that's true. If you're under this amount of stress, there can be a development of the mental breakdowns, right? Where now we're arriving at the doorstep, the possibility of all of these things that we've discussed so far about Chuck accumulating to be extreme paranoia, delusion, and trying to create that story around it to give himself a backstory.
Well, and really, what's the end result? Chuck and his family would have had to go into witness protection. this point, right?
Sure.
Like,
Sure.
I mean, what's the end? I think if someone is playing both sides, it's either got to end with you successfully playing both sides, but ending up having to give up everything.
Good point.
Or
there's really only two endings to the story.
Yeah.
And Chuck had the unfortunate one, right?
Yeah.
So, but the things that go on in part one of the story where he shows up after being missing for 3 days and his hands are zip tied and he tells his wife that there's a hallucinogenic drug that's been painted down his throat, which has never appeared in any other crime or in any other story, at least that we know of, right? And it's not in popular culture or in the true crime genre, really. And then, it's known that he was paranoid, so he was wearing a bulletproof vest everywhere, driving his daughters back and forth to school. But then he, what we assume is voluntarily, goes missing again. And I say voluntarily because it was proven that he was, in fact, at the motel, the Lamppost Motel.
Well, he was seen at several places, including restaurants, during the time where he was quote unquote missing.
Right. Like he didn't leave the state or the country. And
he didn't
good
even
old
leave
Ruth,
the town.
Yeah, he didn't even leave the town. And his wife Ruth is just at home, still hasn't noticed he's gone.
Yeah, well.
She's not out looking for him because he's
that,
around. So there's so much here. But it really, again, like I said, he was involved in such deep crimes, shady things going on that really kind of any of those answers could work backwards and fit in.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So talked a little bit about the mop. We've talked a little bit about the potential for a treasury agent. We've talked a little bit about government involvement, although there's probably the least supporting evidence for that. But Amy, you and I have kind of developed our own little theories.
I mean, we have a little bit. I mean, just things that don't make sense. I don't know that it's a theory for me, but it's just something that I'm just like, I can't get off.
And I have one too.
Okay.
So it's time now for the surprise Amy and Sarah segment. All right. And we have kept this part of the story separate from each other. Like,
yeah, no.
I haven't heard Amy's, what do you want to call it? You said it's not a theory, but.
Yeah, I just have questions.
Okay.
I guess things in the story that don't make sense.
Okay. Amy's kept those separate from me. I have not told her mine. So we are going to find out at the same time right now what those are.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
On the count of 3, I want you to say the one or two words that describe your ideas here. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
The
green
wife.
eyes. Okay. So they are different.
They are different.
Okay. I want you to go first.
You do?
Before I get into my green eyes theory. I'm calling it a theory because, I'm just crowning myself the theory queen.
Yeah. No, you're good. Okay. I will say that Chuck's wife, Ruth, she died of cancer in 2006. And so this is not like an allegation or anything. I mean, she, according to her obituary, she participated in and was devout in her community and social organizations. And anyway, there was a lot of good things that she did for her community.
And she's not here to defend herself, I think is what you're saying.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. And I'm not trying to paint her into this bad
fair.
light, but this is what doesn't make sense because I am a wife and I have a problem with Ruth's story because in all of this evidence, I'll call it evidence, quote unquote evidence that we have about his disappearances, what he tells her, the FBI people, like all of this stuff. We have one witness to this.
Okay.
And it's Ruth.
All right. Good point.
And what if Ruth is not telling the truth?
I mean, she didn't have a lot to say in all reality, so that's very plausible.
I mean, as a wife, having a husband go missing
Twice.
Like, I would be panicked.
Distraught.
There would be police reports, like friends, family, like everybody would know he was missing.
On foot searches.
And she claims years later that she had no idea, like this money laundering, like all this stuff that was going on, that he had kept this from her. However, how do you go missing, staying on the other side of town, or even, I mean, we're assuming it's the other side of town. I don't know where their house is. Yeah. No, like in the motels and the restaurants where he is, you know, like, and not like know that he's there.
Mm-hmm.
And, you talked about green eyes, but Ruth's the one that was like, oh yeah, like she contacted me. What if Ruth is the informant?
What if Ruth is green eyes?
No, not green eyes, but what if she is the informant that is informing the CIA, the FBI on Chuck's
Activities. Okay, I love that idea. But also, what if Ruth is Green Eyes?
I mean, she could have been Green Eyes, and it would have made sense. Like, that could have been her code name. She could have been the one, or she could have had like another operative or whatever be Green Eyes, and they kind of concocted this story together and whatever. But I'm just saying that I don't think the wife is squeaky clean.
Okay, that hadn't even crossed my mind. That blows my mind though, because I mean, it's plausible that if she's involved, like you're proposing,
Yeah.
if she's involved, that she would possibly make phone calls to throw the police off.
Yeah. Well, and also too, like, I don't know, like your husband's having a mental breakdown. He's stressed out. He's at work, like whatever. He brings home files. Like, I mean, women are kind of really smart. Not kind of, but they are. It's not going to take a rocket scientist to kind of...
Amy, you're not making our case right now.
No.
It's not going to take a rocket surgeon to figure out those files don't look good.
No, but just to be like, something's wrong, right? Like, women intuition is going to be like, something's wrong with my husband.
Sure.
Like, is he cheating? Is he, like whatever is going down? And she comes across the fact that he's weekly and monthly laundering huge amounts of money.
Sure. And or he does, well, I mean, we know that he goes missing for 3 days and then comes back and tells her this wild story. He has a hallucinogenic drug.
I mean, this is all of her account though.
That's what I'm saying. So 3 days.
You take Ruth's eyewitness account, quote unquote, away from the story. What do we actually know?
That's
Chuck
so
is
true.
found in the desert.
That's so true.
Sarah's making eyes at our audio guy in the sound booth.
I have been so surprised today. Like, Justin's stuff was so scandalous. I thought I had a bunch of scandal to reveal, and it turns out I got nothing compared to you two. I mean, that's a very interesting theory. And again, right back to the first kidnapping, right? He comes back and says that all these crazy things happened. And I mean, you would be panicked as a wife, right? That this scary thing happened to your husband. Well, then he goes missing again for 9 days. And you don't even think to call the police and be like, hey, guess what happened a few months ago?
And how well to deflect from you to say to other people, like, well, he said his treasure ID was missing. They're not going to look at you. You don't know what that means. You're claiming you're innocent. Like, you know what I'm saying? I don't know.
I want to know what color eyes Ruth has. Although she is seen on an interview. I think they're brown, but that...
I mean, green eyes could have been anybody.
Well, that's my theory. So
I'll
get into that. Yeah. But yours just blew me away. And I know you didn't expect me to take that and run with it, but they could intertwine. I mean, she could, in fact... Green Eyes was never identified, and she gives another odd element to the story. Also, Chuck had this $2 bill clipped in his underwear with the scripture Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8 on it. Ruth could have seen that at home, doing his laundry, doing whatever, and then concocts a story to support that mysterious stuff was going on.
Or it's not in his handwriting, which is why I asked about if it was in his handwriting.
Oh my goodness. All right.
I mean, she could have put that in there to kind of throw this all off. Like I said, I mean, from all aspects of her life and whatever, there's no evidence that she is this person. But
yeah,
I mean, it would be, there's a lot of holes in Ruth's story that I can't reconcile in my mind.
Very interesting. Just to throw it out there, since we're talking about this, we're speculating. These are ideas, like you said, things that don't make sense. Again, Ruth isn't here to defend herself. And I know her daughters are still alive, we believe, right? So it's not personal.
She does have personal. Like 8 grandchildren.
Yeah, it's not personal at all. It's just curious.
Yeah.
It's so curious.
It's such a bizarre case that it causes you to have theories.
Absolutely, it does. I love that.
Okay, so green eyes.
Okay, so here's my green eyes theory. I'm calling it a theory. It might not be. I don't know. It could just be a story I'm concocting, but it kind of, to me, makes a lot of sense. So we know that Green Eyes appears in the story when she calls Ruth after the second disappearance of Chuck, 9 days into the disappearance, right?
Yeah.
And she says this very mysterious statement and then disappears. What she says to Ruth is, it's actually a lie, right? Because she says Chuck is okay.
Well, he was at the time.
I mean, he was alive, but I don't think he was okay, you know?
Yeah.
And she reads the scripture, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Now, how would Green Eyes know about that scripture reference? Unless she'd seen the $1 bill or Chuck had said something to her
or
in
Ruth
person.
told her. Or it's Ruth.
Ruth told her, or it is Ruth. Either way.
Because the wife would know like her husband's hiding out with $60,000.
Well, I mean, what if you're just washing your husband's underwear and you're like, what's this $2 bill?
Yeah.
Anyway, she had some kind of insight, whether she was the wife or the mistress. That's been proposed.
Yeah.
That perhaps Green Eyes was a mistress. They're staying at a hotel together. Now, it is just referenced in the sources that I've read and listened to that she was seen on camera, or a woman, I should say, was seen on camera with Chuck at the motel, but it doesn't necessarily say that she was there the whole time or in and out. We don't know. But in a motel where you're hiding out, you can come and go in the cover of night.
Yeah.
You know, okay. So she's perhaps a mistress. Chuck's head is getting big. He's wealthy. He's running with the mob, but he's not in the mob. Maybe he got a big ego and got himself a mistress. Or it's very possible that Ruth is also a secretive agent, right? Green Eyes sounds like a code name, does it not? I mean,
yeah, no, for sure.
Sounds like it. However, she's a big player in this for me. So to keep going, I think there's a good possibility that if she called, and I'll get to maybe kind of the explanation in a second here, but she called Ruth and reads this random scripture. And if we're assuming right now that Ruth isn't Green Eyes and isn't involved, okay?
Yeah.
Ruth had no response for this. Like, what Ecclesiastes, what are you saying?
Yeah.
I wonder if Green Eyes had discovered this $2 bill, whether it was on Chuck's body at the time or she had seen it with the briefcase of $60,000 he had, that she could have been calling Ruth to drop this scripture and see if Ruth responded. If it was a code word.
Yeah.
Or if she says, she quotes the scripture and then Ruth is like, oh, that's the signal. Okay, Green Eyes is, someone I can trust. Chuck told me to trust anyone who references this scripture, right? Why else would you randomly call Ruth and be like, hey, Ecclesiastes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's my favorite book.
How would you choose just one thing? I mean, there was 100 things written on that $2 bill.
So it has relevance.
Yeah.
It has to.
Yeah.
I think it's likely that she was calling to see if Ruth had a reaction.
Interesting.
All right. So she would have had to have come across that reference though, right? We know that. So she does tell the sheriff when she calls after Chuck's body has been discovered. Okay, she calls the sheriff and tells this elaborate story about being at the motel. She admits it, that she's at the motel with Chuck. She's the woman on camera. This is what she says. And she tells this story about how Chuck showed her the briefcase of $60,000 in cash, which back then was $60,000. Today would be valued at over $300,000. So it's a lot of money, is my point. She never reveals who she is, though, and never follows up with anything that leads to the death. And so could this possibly just be a decoy story?
I mean,
Again, she's randomly calling Ruth and just talking about scripture. She's randomly calling the sheriff's department and outing herself. Like, why would you just volunteer that, you know? So is this a decoy story?
Like a red herring?
A red herring, exactly. So she references this money, right? But it's never seen or discovered. No briefcases ever found. There's no evidence that it came up after Chuck's body had been discovered, right? So it disappears into thin air if in fact it existed. So what if, doesn't matter if she was a mistress, a secret agent, she was perhaps hired by the mob or part of the mob and was a lure for Chuck?
Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
Send in a beautiful woman with green eyes.
Yeah. Be a
distraction. Get his attention. Yeah. Get Chuck to trust you. She could have been any of these things, right? Was she possibly a seductress sent by the mob to ensure that Chuck shows up at the murder site?
Interesting.
Or not even just the mob, but a partner in crime that she was working with.
Yeah.
Anyone on the inside. She could have been a partner to anyone.
Yeah.
And she was the seductress. I don't know what other good word there is for it. Hey, so carrying on with this, Chuck was shot with one bullet.
Yes.
He wasn't strangled, drowned, overpowered, tortured. A woman could very easily take a shot to the back of someone's head and end their life quickly, right?
Yeah.
So it could have been a woman that ended his life.
Yeah.
There's no sign of a struggle. Or again, he wasn't, like I said, strangled or asphyxiated, know. So there didn't have to be a lot of physical force involved necessarily, right? So what if they arrive at the murder scene? Chuck has this handwritten map, this drawn map of where to go. They get there. No matter who she's connected to, again, right? No matter who she's connected to, Chuck had several weapons of choice and ammunition in the vehicle, right? But he is found dead next to his .357.
Yeah.
What if Chuck thinks that Green Eyes is his partner, his mistress, his friend, his confidant, whatever. So he hands her his gun for protection. Hey, we're getting to this site where we're going to meet the hitman. I've got the cash. You hold this for protection. Because he's wearing a bulletproof vest.
I mean, yeah.
And he has a knife in his belt and he has more weapons in the car. So here's my thing. She's there with him. It was her job to get him there. He hands her the 357. They exit the car. He's walking forward. Perhaps he sees who he thinks he's there to meet. And from behind, at least 12 inches, Green Eyes shoots Chuck in the head once behind the ear.
Interesting. I mean, anything's plausible at this point, right?
Anything is plausible. Now, for this to all be true, she would have had to have had a ride back into town or an escape. Maybe she hoofed it on foot. I don't know. But the murder site's 40 miles away from southwest of Tucson. But that would make perfect sense if she double-crossed him, we'll say, or crossed him, set him up, whatever you want to call it.
I mean, the money's gone. She's got the money, or someone's got the money.
The money's gone. She's making these mysterious calls, but she's referencing specific codes, if you will, codes. I'm saying the scripture. Hang with me. It's plausible that she and her partner in crime set this up because she knew about the money, or they knew Chuck had money.
Yeah.
The hitman or her partner arrives on scene. Chuck starts to walk towards him. She kills him from behind. They get in their vehicle or however they arrived, and they head out.
Interesting.
Green Eyes is never heard from again.
Yeah.
Now, all the way back to the ledger and the duplicate files that we were talking about before, okay? I had stated that I believe it's possible that the code or the map, if you will, that was drawn on the $2 bill had to have led to something.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just ramblings. And there are a lot of tie-ins. Go back and listen to it if you haven't. But there's possible tie-ins to Freemasons, to the Founding Fathers. Like, there's a whole bunch of potential. Being
Tucson street names.
Yep. Being a thorough way for drugs to come in and out of Mexico into the United States. There's all kinds of things. However, it's most likely that it was some kind of a map. Maps always have something at the end of them. All right. So it's very possible, according to my theory that I'm saying here, that either Green Eyes or whomever believes that there is more money, his stacked cash, or his ledger and files at the end of that map. And Green Eyes called Ruth to drop the code word Ecclesiastes 12:1-8 to see if Ruth knew the answer to that.
Interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
Because it's too random otherwise. Otherwise, there's no explanation for it unless Ruth is Green Eyes, right?
I mean.
So she could have had this $2 bill or had seen it and was calling what you would think the closest person in the world to Chuck is, dropping the scripture to see if you can get the solve to the puzzle, set Chuck up, murder him, take his money, take his ledger, take both, and you disappear into thin air.
Interesting.
Green Eyes is never heard from again.
No, she's not. Wow. So crazy.
Also, just really quickly, if we're going with the theory that Chuck was murdered and this was not a suicide, which is what we both here believe to be true, right? Someone wiped the gun clean.
Yeah.
Or was wearing gloves.
Yeah, but I will say 1977, Either
way, fingerprints weren't found.
Yeah.
Whether that was cleaned up after or prevented in the first place, there is gun-pound residue. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Say you're wearing gloves, so there's no fingerprints on the weapon.
Yeah.
You kill your target. There's gunpowder residue now on your hands. And you've got gloves on, leather gloves, some kind of material, right?
Yeah.
You remove your gloves. You wipe them on Chuck's hands. You leave the gun that doesn't need to be touched ever again because the residue is already on you. And bada boom, bada bing, we have a terribly staged suicide.
Well, I will say it's in the desert. Chuck had multiple weapons in his car. There's every sense to believe that there was another weapon, that Chuck fired another weapon.
At somebody else?
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, that's possible. Or he was out target practicing before he met up. Who knows?
So you're proposing that he went to the site early to practice some...
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, if you're meeting someone who has a hit on you, Chuck thinks he had someone and he's going to pay off this hit, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to do some target practicing real quick before, this meetup to make sure my aim is good. That makes sense to me, but.
There were no other shell casings found at the scene, though, besides the one shell casing from the bullet in his head. However, they could be shot far out there, I suppose.
Well, and also too, how much did the police overlook and miss?
Well, they just wrapped it up real quick. They had to get home to dinner and they were like, you know what? This is a little confusing. Let's call it a suicide.
Yeah.
Because it's not logical.
No. So that's why I'm just saying, like,
there's a lot of possibilities.
There is. And I think that's why the speculation train. I mean, we've referenced before, FBI profiler analysis paralysis,
Right. Overthinking something.
Yeah.
That's could be very true. So we've gone through a lot. But there's more to tell. Can you believe it?
No,
I can't. More. There's more to tell. This crime actually continues.
Yeah.
Chuck is dead.
So wild.
But there's more to come. So we're going to take a break here because we are exhausted. And we're going to take a breather and get back into part 3, where we're going to tell you about the continuation of the story, or the mysterious story.
Deep this hole goes.
Right. We'll wrap up the mysterious death and disappearance of Chuck Morgan.
All right.
Talk to you in a little bit.